Grant was crossing the frozen hills alone when the wind picked up and the sky turned the kind of gray that meant more snow was coming. He had been walking since early morning, his boots crunching through a thick layer of ice with every step. His pack was heavy on his back and his breath came out in small white clouds. The trail ahead curved around a long ridge and disappeared into the dark line of trees. He was tired and cold and he just wanted to reach the next village before dark. He was about halfway across the open stretch of hillside when he stopped. There was a sound. It was small. Barely there. Just a thin, weak noise coming from somewhere beneath the snow to his left. Grant stood still and listened. The wind moved around him and the snow shifted, and for a moment he thought he had imagined it. Then it came again. Soft and broken, like something too small and too tired to be loud. Grant turned toward it. The snow near the base of the cliff wall had collapsed inward, pulling rock and ice down with it. There was a hollow space there, mostly buried now, with only a small dark gap near the bottom where the drift had not fully closed. The sound was coming from inside that gap. Grant dropped to his knees without thinking. He pulled off his gloves and started digging with his bare hands, pushing snow aside in big armfuls. The cold hit his skin immediately, but he kept going. He could hear the sound more clearly now, and there was not just one. There were more. Small voices, weak and broken, coming from somewhere just inside the dark. He dug faster. When the gap was wide enough he pressed his face close and looked inside. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust. Then he saw them. 3 dragon hatchlings. They were tiny, barely the size of small cats, curled together in the corner of the hollow where the rock had protected them from the worst of the collapse. Their scales were pale, almost white, drained of the color that healthy hatchlings carried. 2 of them were trembling. One was not moving at all. They were so cold that Grant could feel it radiating off them even from a distance. His chest tightened. He reached in carefully and pulled the first one out, the one that was not moving. It was light, far too light, and its small body was stiff with cold. Grant pressed it against his neck and held it there with one hand while he reached back in for the second. Then the third. He sat back on his heels in the snow with all 3 hatchlings pressed against his chest and his heart beating very fast. He looked around. There was no mother. No tracks in the snow that were fresh. No sound of wings or movement in the trees. Whatever had brought the cliff face down had happened fast, and whoever should have been here was not. Grant did not spend long thinking about what to do. He unzipped his coat with one hand, tucked all 3 hatchlings inside against his shirt where they could feel his body heat directly, and zipped it back up as far as it would go. They were so small that all 3 fit without much trouble. The one that had not been moving made a faint sound against his chest. Grant exhaled slowly. He moved back to the hollow and started working. The gap was large enough to crawl into if he was careful, and the rock walls inside had held. It was not deep but it was sheltered, which was what mattered. He gathered what dry wood he could find along the tree line, moving quickly with the hatchlings bundled against him, their small warmth beginning to grow just slightly under his coat. By the time he had enough wood he could feel all 3 of them trembling, which he took as a good sign. Trembling meant they were still trying. He built the fire close to the entrance of the hollow, where the rock would catch the heat and hold it, and the wind would not reach it easily. His hands were shaking from the cold by the time he got the flame going, but he kept working, feeding the fire carefully until it was steady and bright and throwing real warmth into the small space. Then he sat down against the back wall, unzipped his coat, and looked at them. Pip, he thought, looking at the smallest one, the one that kept pressing its nose against his collar. The middle one had already started chewing weakly at the edge of his shirt. Cinder. The third one, the one that had not been moving, was now blinking slowly with copper-colored eyes, watching him with an expression that Grant could not quite name. Thorn. He did not know where the names came from. They just arrived, the way some things do when you are sitting in the quiet and everything else has fallen away. Grant wrapped his coat back around all three of them and leaned his head against the rock wall. The fire crackled and the wind moved outside and the snow kept falling, visible through the gap as a slow gray curtain. He had supplies in his pack for 2 days. He had no idea how long he would be here or what he was going to do when morning came. He had no plan, no training for this, no reason that could be written down and handed to someone else. He only knew that when he had heard that sound beneath the snow he had not kept walking. And that somewhere under his coat, pressed against the warmth of his chest, 3 small things were still breathing. That felt like enough for now. The first morning came gray and quiet. Grant woke with his back against the cold rock wall and all 3 hatchlings piled on top of him like they had been there their whole lives. Pip was tucked under his chin. Cinder had worked his way inside the front pocket of Grant's coat and was sleeping with just his nose sticking out. Thorn was sitting upright on Grant's chest, already awake, watching him with those copper-colored eyes like he had been waiting for Grant to open his own. Grant looked at the 3 of them for a long moment. Then he reached into his pack and started thinking about food. He had dried meat, a small block of hard bread, a handful of nuts, and enough tea to last 2 days if he was careful. It was not a lot. He broke a small piece of dried meat into even smaller pieces and held them out in his open palm. Pip smelled it first, then scrambled forward and took a piece with surprising enthusiasm. Cinder climbed out of the pocket and ate without looking up. Thorn took his piece slowly and deliberately, like he was doing Grant a favor by accepting it. Grant ate a smaller portion than he had planned to and told himself that was fine. By midday the fire had settled into a steady low burn and the hollow was warm enough that the hatchlings began to move around. They were unsteady on their feet, their legs still weak from the cold, but they were curious and that curiosity was stronger than any wobble. Pip discovered Grant's bootlaces and pulled at them with great focus. Cinder found the corner where Grant had stacked his extra wood and climbed it twice before sliding back down both times. Thorn walked a slow circle around the entire hollow, sniffing everything, and then came back and sat directly in front of Grant and stared at him. Grant stared back. Thorn blinked once. Then climbed into Grant's lap and went to sleep. Grant sat very still for a while after that. He told himself that evening that he would leave in the morning once he was sure they could hold their own heat. He checked each of them carefully, running his fingers along their small spines, feeling for the warmth that healthy hatchlings were supposed to carry in their scales. Pip and Cinder were already improving fast. Thorn was slower but steady. Another day, Grant thought. Just one more day to be certain. The second morning he woke to Cinder sitting on his face. He moved the hatchling gently and sat up and immediately saw that his pack had been investigated in the night. The hard bread was gone. The bag of nuts had been dragged to the other side of the hollow and mostly emptied. Pip was asleep next to the empty nut bag with a very satisfied expression. Grant looked at his remaining supplies and did the quiet calculations of a man who already knows the answer is not good. He melted snow for water and drank it plain because he was saving the tea. He ate less than the day before and gave the hatchlings the better portion of the dried meat. They ate without hesitation, pushing against each other for position, and Grant found himself watching them with something that was not quite a smile but was close to one. They were getting stronger. He could see it clearly now. Their scales had color again, a deep shifting green on Pip, dark amber on Cinder, and a gray so dark it was almost black on Thorn. They moved with more confidence. Their voices were louder and more demanding. Pip had started making a sound that Grant could only describe as impatient whenever the fire burned low, looking at him pointedly until he added more wood. He added more wood. That evening Grant sat at the entrance of the hollow and looked out at the snow. It was still falling, lighter now, and the sky beyond the trees had the pale look of weather that was finally thinking about clearing. He could leave tomorrow if he chose. The hatchlings were not fully strong but they were far from where they had been. They would survive the night. Probably several nights. He repeated this to himself with some care. Behind him, Thorn made a small sound. Grant looked back. Thorn had positioned himself exactly in the center of Grant's unrolled sleeping mat and was watching him with the calm certainty of an animal that has already decided how things are going to be. Pip was chewing the corner of Grant's spare shirt. Cinder was asleep on the warm flat rock nearest the fire, legs stretched out completely, tail twitching in whatever dream small dragons have. Grant looked at them for a long time. Then he came back inside, moved Thorn over gently to make room, and lay down on the sleeping mat. Thorn immediately moved back to the center and pressed against Grant's side. Pip abandoned the shirt and climbed up to his usual spot under Grant's chin. Cinder did not wake up at all. The fire burned low and steady. Grant stared at the rock ceiling of the hollow and told himself very clearly and very firmly that in the morning he would assess the situation properly and make a sensible decision based on whether the hatchlings were genuinely ready to survive without him. He believed this completely. He was asleep in minutes, warm and buried under 3 small dragons who had never once considered the possibility that he might leave, because to them it was not a possibility at all. He was simply theirs now. They had decided on the first night and had not thought about it since. Grant would figure that out eventually. The 6th morning started like the others. Grant woke with Thorn on his chest and Pip pressed against his neck and Cinder making small impatient noises near the fire because it had burned down in the night. He sat up slowly, moved each hatchling with the careful habit he had developed over the past 5 days, and reached for the last of his wood. His supplies were nearly gone. The dried meat was finished. He had half a block of hard bread left and enough water to last the day if he was careful. He had been telling himself for 3 mornings that today would be the day he figured out a plan. He still did not have one. The hatchlings were strong now. Properly strong. Their scales were bright and their movements were quick and confident. Pip could jump twice his own height and had proven this repeatedly by launching himself at Grant's shoulder from across the hollow. Cinder was faster than he looked and had started chasing shadows on the rock wall with intense focus. Thorn still moved more slowly than the other 2 but his eyes missed nothing and he had a habit of sitting very still and watching the hollow entrance like he was waiting for something. That morning Thorn would be right. Grant was outside gathering the last few sticks of burnable wood from along the tree line when he felt it. A vibration in the ground, faint at first, then building steadily. He straightened and looked toward the tree line. The birds that had been moving through the upper branches went silent all at once. The snow on the nearest pine shifted and fell without wind. Then the trees at the far edge of the clearing cracked and broke apart like they were nothing. Sarah came through them at speed and landed in the clearing so hard the ground jumped under Grant's feet. She was enormous. Far larger than he had imagined a dragon could be up close. Her wingspan had taken out 3 trees on the way down and her landing had thrown a wave of snow in every direction. She was dark green with scales that had gone almost black along her back and sides, and she carried scars across her neck and shoulders that spoke of things Grant did not want to think about. Her eyes were amber, burning bright, and they found him instantly. Grant did not run. He was not sure his legs would have worked if he had tried, but he also did not think running was the right choice. He stood where he was, very still, the small bundle of sticks in his hands, and he met her eyes for exactly 1 second before he looked down at the ground between them. He kept his hands open and his shoulders low and he breathed as steadily as he could manage. Sarah's head dropped toward him. She was close enough that he could feel the heat coming off her in waves. A sound built in her chest, low and enormous, the kind of sound that Grant felt in his back teeth more than he heard with his ears. It was not quite a growl. It was something older than that. Then the hollow behind him erupted. Pip came out first, shooting across the snow at full speed toward Sarah, then stopping halfway and looking back at Grant, then looking at Sarah, then back at Grant again, clearly uncertain about the geography of the situation. Cinder tumbled out right behind him and immediately tried to climb Sarah's front leg with the same enthusiasm he had applied to Grant's wood pile. Thorn came last, walking at his usual careful pace, and stopped beside Grant's boot and sat down. Sarah went still. She looked at Cinder climbing her leg. She looked at Pip bouncing between her and Grant like the ground was hot. She looked at Thorn sitting quietly beside the human's foot like that was simply where he belonged. The great burning sound in her chest shifted into something lower and slower. She lifted her head slightly and watched. Then Pip made his decision. He turned away from Sarah, ran back across the snow, and climbed Grant's coat with his small claws until he reached the familiar spot on Grant's shoulder. He pressed his nose against Grant's jaw and made the small satisfied sound he always made when he had found the right place to be. Sarah watched this. The clearing was completely silent. Grant did not move. He stood with Pip on his shoulder and Thorn at his boot and his heart beating very loudly in his chest, and he waited for whatever was going to happen next with the particular stillness of a man who has accepted that this moment is entirely out of his hands. Sarah looked at him for a long time. Her amber eyes moved over him slowly, reading things that Grant could not name. She looked at the hollow where her hatchlings had survived. She looked at the cold ash of old fires that had kept them warm. She looked at the hatchlings themselves, bright and strong and completely unafraid, pressed against a human who was standing in the snow holding a bundle of sticks with his hands open. Then Sarah lowered her great head. Slowly. All the way down until her chin rested in the snow in front of Grant's feet. Her amber eyes looked up at him from below, still and steady and full of something vast that Grant did not have a word for. He understood anyway. He reached out with one careful hand and rested it gently on the top of her nose. She did not move. Thorn stepped forward from beside Grant's boot and pressed his small head against Sarah's jaw like he was completing something that had already been decided. The wind moved through the trees. The snow settled. Grant stood in a cold clearing with a dragon's head beneath his hand and 3 hatchlings arranged around him like he was something permanent, and he breathed out very slowly. Grant told himself that night that leaving was the right thing to do. Sarah was here now. The hatchlings had their mother. They were warm and strong and safe, and there was absolutely no reason for a man with an empty pack and a village to reach to stay any longer in a hollow carved into a frozen hillside. He had done what needed doing. That was enough. That was more than enough. He believed this completely as he lay in the dark with Pip on his chest and Cinder pressed against his left side and Thorn draped across his boots like a small immovable stone. He believed it slightly less by morning. He packed quietly before the hatchlings were fully awake, moving carefully so as not to disturb them. He folded his sleeping mat and tied it to the outside of his pack. He checked his remaining supplies, which were almost nothing, and organized them anyway out of habit. He laced his boots. He stood up slowly and looked at the 3 of them still bundled together in the warm spot where he had been sleeping. Pip opened one eye. Grant looked away and picked up his pack. He stepped out of the hollow into the sharp morning cold. Sarah was outside, settled in the snow at the edge of the clearing like a dark hill, her head up and her amber eyes open. She watched him come out with his pack on his back and said nothing. Grant looked at her for a moment, then looked at the trail that led down through the trees and away from the hills. He walked to the hollow entrance and crouched down. He told the hatchlings goodbye in a low quiet voice. He told them their mother was here and they were safe and they were going to be fine. He told Pip to stop chewing things that did not belong to him. He told Cinder to be careful on anything he tried to climb. He told Thorn, who was watching him with those still copper eyes, that he was going to be just fine. Thorn blinked once. Grant stood up, adjusted his pack, and walked toward the tree line. He made it about 30 steps before he heard the snow behind him. He stopped and turned around. Pip was bounding across the clearing toward him at full speed, ears flat, moving with complete determination. Cinder was right behind him. Thorn was coming too, at his own pace, unhurried, like the outcome was not in question. Grant watched them come and felt something tighten in his chest. He carried them back one at a time, setting each of them down gently inside the hollow entrance. He gave them a firm and serious look. He pointed at the spot where they were supposed to stay. Thorn sat down immediately. Pip waited until Grant turned around and then followed him again. Grant carried them back a second time. He spoke more firmly on the second attempt. He used a tone he hoped communicated that this was not a game and that he was a man with a direction and a purpose and a village to reach. Cinder tilted his head and looked at Grant's bootlaces. Pip had already started moving before Grant reached the tree line. The third time Grant carried all three back at once, one under each arm and Thorn tucked against his chest, and he stayed crouched at the hollow entrance for longer. He looked at each of them carefully. He looked at Sarah, who had been watching the entire process from her spot at the edge of the clearing with an expression that Grant could not quite read. He stood up and walked away for the third time. He got further on the third attempt. He was almost to the first bend in the trail, almost to the point where the hollow would disappear behind the trees, when he heard it. Not the scramble of small claws in snow this time. Something heavier. Something large moving through the clearing with slow and deliberate steps. Grant stopped. He turned around. Sarah was walking toward him. Not quickly. Not with any urgency. Just walking, steady and calm, crossing the clearing in his direction with all three hatchlings moving alongside her. She stopped when she reached him and stood there in the snow, close enough that Grant could feel the warmth coming off her scales. She looked at him with her amber eyes and said nothing. She simply waited. Grant looked at the hatchlings. Pip was already climbing his coat. Cinder was investigating his boot. Thorn stood beside Sarah's front leg and watched Grant with the patient expression of someone who has already seen how a story ends. Grant looked at Sarah. Sarah looked back at him. There was no sound in the trees. The wind had gone quiet. The snow sat still and white across the hills in every direction and the morning light was pale and clean and the whole world felt like it was waiting for him to understand something he had been slow to understand. Grant stood there for a long moment. Then he reached up and took Pip gently off his coat and held him against his chest instead. He looked down at Cinder and then at Thorn. He looked at Sarah, who had walked out of the clearing and into the cold just to stand beside him. He unslung his pack from his shoulder. He held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, thinking about the trail and the village and all the reasonable and sensible things that lay in that direction. Then he set it down in the snow. Sarah made a low quiet sound in her chest, not the great warning rumble from the day before but something smaller and softer, and she turned back toward the hollow. Grant picked up Thorn with his free hand and followed her through the snow and did not look back at the trail. The hollow was not going to be enough. Grant figured this out on the first evening after he set his pack down, when he looked at Sarah settling herself outside the entrance and realized that the space he had been living in for 6 days was barely large enough for him and 3 hatchlings, let alone a dragon the size of a barn. He sat at the entrance and looked at the surrounding hillside for a long time, reading the land the way a man does when he is no longer thinking about leaving but about staying. There was a better spot. 30 feet along the cliff base the rock curved inward and created a natural alcove, wider and deeper than the hollow, with a flat area in front of it large enough for Sarah to stretch out without her tail disappearing into the trees. The ground there was sheltered from the worst of the wind. It would take work but it was there. Grant started the next morning. He did not have much. His pack had rope, a small axe, a folding knife, and the kind of general tools a man carries when he travels alone through rough country. He used all of it. He cleared the alcove, packed the floor flat, and used timber from fallen trees to frame out a shelter against the back wall. It was slow work in the cold and he stopped often to warm his hands at a small fire he kept going nearby. The hatchlings helped in the way that hatchlings help, which is to say they made everything take longer and were completely certain they were being useful. Pip carried sticks to the wrong location with great enthusiasm. Cinder dismantled one section of framing that Grant had just finished because something behind it had smelled interesting. Thorn sat on the supply pile and watched everything with the air of a foreman who had serious concerns about the crew. Sarah watched from her chosen spot and did not interfere. By the time the next snow came the shelter was standing. It was not beautiful, but it was solid and warm and large enough that Grant could stand upright inside it and have room for 3 growing hatchlings and all the chaos they produced. Sarah had already pressed herself against the outer wall on the first night, her body blocking the wind from the north side, and in the morning Grant noticed that his shelter was warmer than it had any right to be. He put his hand against the wall where Sarah rested on the other side. The stone was warm all the way through. Winter moved slowly past them. Grant hunted and gathered and learned the land around the hills in a way he never had before because now he had reasons to know it well. Sarah ranged further out and sometimes returned with food that Grant did not ask too many questions about. The hatchlings grew with a speed that still surprised him. Pip, who had once fit in Grant's coat pocket, was already up to his knee by the time the deepest cold arrived. Cinder was broader and faster every week. Thorn was the quietest grower, but one morning Grant noticed that Thorn's eyes were level with his shoulder and understood that quiet did not mean slow. They followed him everywhere. Down to the stream where Grant collected water in the mornings, all 3 of them moving through the trees around him like an escort that had not been asked for and could not be dismissed. To the edge of the hills where he checked his snares, with Pip investigating every snare before Grant could reach it and Cinder eating the results before Grant could stop him. Through the long evenings inside the shelter where Grant sat by the fire and the hatchlings arranged themselves around him in the configuration they had decided was correct, which had not changed since the first night in the hollow. Word travels in the way that unusual things always travel. Quietly at first, then faster. A hunter from the nearest village saw Grant moving through the eastern tree line with 3 dragons following him in a line. He told people when he got home. Those people told others. By the time the first thaw arrived there were visitors. They came carefully, stopping at the edge of the clearing and looking at Sarah before they looked at anything else. Grant always walked out to meet them the same way, calm and unhurried, and he always let them see the hatchlings first because the hatchlings were impossible to be frightened of. Pip would investigate new people immediately and thoroughly, checking pockets and pulling at laces with cheerful disregard for personal space. Cinder would show off, which mostly meant climbing things at speed and looking back to confirm he was being watched. Thorn would simply sit beside Grant and observe the visitors with his steady copper eyes until they stopped being nervous, which never took as long as they expected. Sarah stayed where she was and let them look. People came from 3 villages eventually. Some came more than once. A woman named Faye who kept goats in the valley below started leaving bundles of supplies at the clearing edge every few weeks without being asked, and Grant never saw her do it but always found them. An old man named Burl came 4 times just to sit at the clearing edge and watch the hatchlings play, and he never said very much but always looked like a man who had been given back something he thought he had lost. Grant understood that. He thought about it sometimes in the evenings when the fire was low and the shelter was full of the warm breathing weight of 3 sleeping dragons and Sarah's tail was curled against the outer wall and the hills outside were quiet and deep and completely still. He had walked into those hills alone with a heavy pack in a direction and nothing waiting for him at the end of the trail that he could not find somewhere else just as easily. He had heard a sound beneath the snow. He had dug with his bare hands because the sound was there and he was there, and those 2 facts together had not left him any real choice. He had not planned any of it. He had not asked for any of it. He had only meant to keep 3 small things alive through one bad night and then go on his way like a man with somewhere to be. But Pip was asleep on his boots and Cinder was pressed against his left side and Thorn had his head across Grant's lap and Sarah was warm against the wall outside and the fire was burning low and steady. Grant looked at all of it in the quiet dark. He had not gone on his way. And he had never once, in all the months that followed, wished that he had.